So last night, Bernie Sanders scored an endorsement that on the face of it doesn't really seem like a big deal, but when you dig a little deeper, the significance really starts to shine. Dali Myers endorsed Bernie Sanders last night. If you don't know who she is, she's a relatively low-level, municipal-level politician in South Carolina. She's an African-American woman, and until recently, she was publicly supporting Joe Biden for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination. But she wasn't really enthusiastic about Biden or indeed anyone. But she said that she moved to Bernie Sanders because at the end of the day, her goal is to defeat Donald Trump, and she worries about Biden's ability to generate enthusiasm among the Democratic base, among the types of people that the Democratic Party need to get out the vote. Young people specifically, she notes. Whereas Bernie Sanders has convinced her over the last few weeks that he is that guy to get out the vote. And this is absolutely crucial. All of this is. South Carolina is likely Joe Biden's strongest state in the early primary process. Bernie Sanders, I feel, is going to have a really good result in Iowa and New Hampshire, and maybe even Nevada too. But South Carolina is going to be one of those states where Joe Biden can rack up a big win. But if he's losing support amongst African American representatives there, it might be a sign that even if he does win South Carolina, the win won't be as big as some people are projecting, because African American support is Joe Biden's firewall. It's his level of support where he dwarfs the rest of the field. It's one of the reasons why Kamala Harris and Cory Booker never really took off, because Joe Biden from the very beginning here had a basic lock on a strong plurality of African American support, especially as those supporters get older. Older African Americans are very much wedded to Joe Biden. And Mayers isn't a young woman. So at the end of the day, an older African American woman going from Biden to Bernie Sanders is a very important demographic switch when it's represented as a narrative. It might not necessarily be the start of a wave, but it's an interesting data point nonetheless. And the crucial point again is that this is an argument about electability, not about policy, not about vision, not about philosophy, electability. And as I've been noting on this channel over my past few videos, Bernie Sanders is undeniably surging, but the reason why Biden still has an edge for a lot of Democratic primary voters is because he's perceived as the anti-Trump choice. That Bernie Sanders increasingly is seen as the guy that cares about Democrats and their values and their vision for the future, but Joe Biden is the one that will get his sleeves up and defeat Donald Trump. And many Democrats still believe that. The CNN poll we covered yesterday showed Bernie Sanders moving in the right direction on the question of electability, but it's not fast enough, strong enough. Biden still leads that question by more than 20 points. Bernie needs to close that. And having an African American woman from South Carolina go over to Bernie, not because of his positions on any policy, but because she feels he's the best one to defeat Donald Trump, has to be terrifying for Joe Biden and his supporters. It's one thing to lose people to Bernie on passion. Biden's never tried to run this campaign on passion. His own wife sells Joe Biden as the guy you might not like, but who can get the job done. That's his wife talking about him. So he's not worried about losing people over passion. He's got to be terrified over losing people over pragmatism. And Dali Myers here, she explains in this press release that she doesn't see herself as a quote-unquote progressive. She sees herself as middle of the road. She sees herself in many ways on the right-leaning side of the Democratic Party on a lot of issues. And that makes sense. She's a bit older. Certain parts of the African American community of the older side tend to be more on the conservative side of the Democratic Party, and being from South Carolina, a more conservative part of the country, none of that is too surprising. But that's just another example of how Bernie Sanders is broadening his coalition. At first, going back to 2015, 2016, Bernie had support a lot of support, but it was almost entirely tied to real diehard progressives. But this time, Bernie Sanders is bringing on new people. He's bringing on people who want to defeat Donald Trump, who understand that even if they identify a bit more moderately than Bernie Sanders, it's still Bernie and his movement that's going to get the job done. And again, that has to be terrifying for Joe Biden, because he's not just losing self-proclaimed leftists to Bernie, he's losing people who might be seen as the sort of Joe Biden Democrats. The sort of people who have always been predicated on, I'm a good centrist Democrat, and that's the sort of person needed to defeat Republicans in close elections, and we can't win if we run to the left. And yet you see some of these people now moving to Bernie. So on the one hand, this is literally just one person who holds a relatively unimportant political office in South Carolina. So I don't want to overstate this particular data point, but as a narrative builder, it's undeniably valuable to Bernie Sanders and undeniably damaging to Joe Biden. And in politics, especially in a primary process where narrative and momentum are king, these sorts of stories can really catch fire. And I think that Bernie Sanders has a real opportunity here, and so do his supporters, his campaign staff, and volunteers, to use this as a fundamental talking point. That Bernie Sanders isn't just getting people on board because of Medicare for all. Heck, Dolly Myers here seems to be hedging on the fact that Bernie Sanders will be moderated by Congress. I don't necessarily agree, but even if you have people concerned about Bernie Sanders' policies, the point is moderates feel they can move to Bernie for the electability question even when they disagree with Bernie on some of Bernie's core policies or feel that Bernie might have the right idea, but he goes a little bit too far. The fact is, this is the sort of thing every Bernie Sanders supporter needs to tell their friends that are on the fence. Because if Bernie is flipping centrist and right-leaning Democrats in South Carolina who are African American, Bernie Sanders is really starting to tear through Joe Biden's firewall. And that's the last barrier between Bernie Sanders and the nomination.